Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. This week in Illinois in Focus, we'll discuss Wednesday's State of the State budget address by Governor Pritzker, who made headlines by referencing Nazis 6 times while criticizing President Donald Trump. We'll also discuss some of the details of Pritzker's budget proposal and why he didn't address ethics reforms at the Capitol a week after the corruption conviction of longtime former House Speaker Michael Mannion. All that and more when we return.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. Governor J.B. Pritzker gave his joint State of the State and budget address Wednesday, and while his record $55.2 billion spending plan was the focus of the speech, he brought national attention to himself when referencing Nazis 6 times while criticizing President Donald Trump. Joining me to discuss this is Illinois Associate Editor Greg Bishop. Greg, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. How and why is Governor Pritzker comparing Trump's administration to a regime that committed genocide?
Yeah, it's something that as we got an advance copy of the speech, quickly read through it. And, the speech talked about some of the history of the state of Illinois and Abraham Lincoln and the importance of the state to get a balanced budget. And he threw out a couple of different other policy proposals I'm sure we'll talk about. But the last 5 minutes of his speech, which ran about 40 plus minutes, focused on Nazi Germany. And he talked about the Nazis that wanted to march in Illinois decades ago and how the ACLU stood up and actually fought for their free speech rights. But ultimately, he kind of talked about all of that in context of the new Trump administration. And what he says was a warning to Illinoisans and elsewhere, people that need to possibly be a stop to any type of autocratic regime that could come out of the Trump administration. And, the governor, he mentioned Nazis 6 times in that last 5 minutes. But when we asked how that's not an insult to more than half of the American voting public who voted for Trump, Pritzker pushed back and said that he wasn't comparing or saying that Trump was a Nazi or that Republicans were Nazis. He was just trying to highlight the concerns he sees of a Trump administration trying to buck federal courts, trying to be an autocrat. And really, he wanted to raise that issue as something pretty prominent in his speech about Illinois. But obviously, the fallout from this instantly, some Republicans started walking out of the chamber during that joint session of the General Assembly. And then afterwards, Republicans critical of the governor's speech, not just about the substance of the spending plan, which, again, I'm sure we'll touch on here, but many of them demanded an apology from the governor, saying that his comments were out of line, saying that they were juvenile, and even saying that they were dangerous. State Representative Adam Niemerg said that Pritzker's rhetoric really would amplify those who would want to do harm to Republicans, and seems to go against the political violence that Niemerg said Pritzker claims to condemn. And even today, as we're recording this Thursday, the Illinois House was in session. State Representative Stephen Reich got up in the middle of floor debate for a point of personal privilege and demanded an apology. And Reich said, in no way have Republicans been anti-Semitic at all. He said that Republicans at the Illinois State House are the ones that have been filing resolutions in support of the state of Israel. And he said that Republicans are far from being autocratic, and the governor should know that. And Reich referenced the 40 plus emergency declarations and hundreds of executive orders that the governor used during the COVID-19 pandemic, essentially ruling the state by executive fiat during that time, something that Reich said is very autocratic, and the governor should realize that. But even those comments from Reich got some pushback from Democrats on the House floor. State Representative Daniel Dittich said that as a member of the Jewish faith, he took offense to Reich's comments. And Democratic State Representative Jennifer Gahn Gershowitz said that Reich had no right to make those comments. So I don't think this is the last we're going to hear of the criticism and the fallout from the governor's references to Nazis during his budget speech. But clearly, it's something that's ruffling a lot of feathers as we are, not even a month into the Trump administration.
Trump was the target of 2 assassination attempts in the run-up to the November election. There were plenty of criticisms of both sides for the hateful rhetoric against each other. And now here we are into February. Trump has been in office for about a month, and that rhetoric continues. Governor Pritzker had to know his comments were going to bring him national attention. There's been speculation that Pritzker might be considering a run for the White House. Does this fuel that even more?
I imagine, the governor's had a lot of time already on various cable news channels to talk about Illinois and what he's working to try to have policies in place to counter anything that they see as troubling coming from the Trump administration. There's been speculation for years that Pritzker is vying for a spot at the White House, even during the Kamala Harris era when Joe Biden stepped down from being the nominee and Harris was installed. Pritzker was vying to possibly be a vice presidential pick. But now here we are with the 2024 election behind us, a new president in the White House, 2028. It's rapidly approaching. So I think over these next 2 years, the governor, he hasn't announced yet that he's running for re-election for 2026. But there's a ton of speculation all over the Capitol and beyond that Pritzker's lining himself up to get more into the national spotlight so that he could possibly get that high profile on the national stage and put his hat into the ring for the 2028 presidential election.
Greg, let's go back then to his budget address, what he was meant to be talking about. He's proposing a $55.2 billion fiscal 2026 budget, which is $2 billion more than the current fiscal budget, which is also a record, a historic high. Give us some of the details of his budget proposal.
Yeah, so this is $15 billion more than what the governor had when he first took office, or 37% increase from 2019. There's a lot of spending in this, $55 billion. That's just the state money. When you include the federal funds coming in, it's upwards to $130 billion. Now, the governor says no tax increases. He's going to try to find efficiencies. This all comes after a COGFO report in November highlighted how there could be a more than $3 billion budget deficit heading into the next fiscal year, and a $4 billion deficit in the next year after that, and then a $5 billion deficit for the 3 years after that. But the governor acknowledged that it's going to be a tight budget season. He talked about the need for tightening the belt and finding efficiencies and freezing hiring and even eliminating old boards and commissions that are no longer active. But with all of that, you have continued spending. Some of the areas, increased spending in K through 12 education, the evidence-based funding model, giving more than $350 million to the state's schools. He's looking to increase monetary award program dollars. Those are MAP grants for eligible college students. He's looking to increase community colleges to allow some of them to have 4-year bachelor's degrees. Another area that had a lot of criticism leading up to the budget address, the cost for non-citizens. And in particular in that area, there are 2 programs that the state of Illinois has had in place for several years. One is the health benefits for immigrant adults, and that was healthcare coverage subsidized by the Illinois taxpayer, and some federal funds being used for that too. That went to non-citizen migrants in the state who were under the age of 42. So that's one program. Another program is the health benefits for immigrant seniors, and that was for those who were of an older age to get that subsidized healthcare coverage. This has been reported to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it ballooned even more in previous years, and Republicans are really critical of this. Well, the governor's budget, it still keeps the health benefits for immigrant seniors at a cost of around $127 or so million. But, Dan, it eliminates the health insurance benefits for immigrant adults. So those who were 42 to 65, they're not going to be covered under the budget if legislators approve the governor's plan. So there's a lot of spending here, right? I mean, it's going to cover everything from education. 25% of the state's budget is going to cover that. Pension funds, about 19% is going to be covered from the budget for that, and a whole host of other spending all across the board. It is the most expensive state budget being proposed for state taxpayers.
Greg, you talked to, immediately after Pritzker's Wednesday speech, you talked to White Report's President Ted Dabrowski. He noted with the education funding increase, he noted the outcomes that our students across the state, the poor outcomes that the students across the state are seeing. Tell us more about what Ted talked to you about the budget.
Yeah. And, when you hear the governor during his speech, and people can watch that in its entirety and even read the transcript at thecentersquare.com. The governor talked about some of the areas of education that have seen increases in, various types of proficiency levels. But Dabrowski says reading and language arts still abysmal, despite the state continuing to increase spending on education year after year after year, and despite the state having an average per pupil cost of more than $24,000 per year. So there's been criticism for years about how more money does not seem to be helping the situation, as students aren't performing as people would hope, especially with the amount of money that's going out for it. So Dabrowski, he talked about the need to really, not focus on the dollars, but more on the education. And the issue of education actually came to a flashpoint during a House Education Appropriations Committee this week. It was supposed to be just an introductory committee saying, hey, this is the chairman, this is the vice chairman, this is the minority spokesperson. But when it got to the minority spokesperson, State Representative Blaine Wilhauer, he talked about how he hopes that the committee can really get to focusing on excellence instead of equity. And the chairman, Will Davis, he fired back and said, well, we need equity because some communities have been pushed to the side for too long and we need to focus on them. Wilhauer said, that's fine. You can focus on that, but excellence needs to take priority. And they debated that back and forth for about 6 minutes or so. So clearly, this is going to be an issue moving forward as they craft a budget, but also as we see, continued updates on test scores from math and science and reading and language arts, not being as good as one would think with the amount of tax dollars that are going out for that.
Pritzker's Wednesday speech came exactly 1 week after longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan was convicted on 10 corruption-related charges. Republicans for years have been calling for ethics reforms at the State House. Yeah. Governor Pritzker makes no mention of it, even though Madigan trial is fresh in everybody's minds, just in the rearview mirror. What do you make of that?
Yeah, we really haven't heard much at all about ethics reforms, other than from Republicans here at the State House, but they are in the super minority. So will we actually have some substantive conversations about term limits, for instance, or about giving the legislative inspector general more independence, or maybe tightening up lobbying regulations? These are just a handful of some of the things that Republicans have been pushing for years. But the fact that we have heard very little about ethics reforms, even in the lead up to the Madigan trial and even after the Madigan trial, is pretty telling. A statement we got back from House Speaker Chris Welch, who followed Madigan after Madigan lost the speakership. He said in the statement after Madigan's conviction on 10 of the 23 counts that he always thought the courts was where this needed to be dealt with. But then he pivoted, and instead of talking about ethics, he said that Democrats are going to focus on working families and trying to protect them from what may be coming out of Washington. So again, I think that that statement coming from the speaker, not really talking about the need for focusing on more ethics legislation, speaks volumes, and Republicans see that, and I imagine they'll continue to push for ethics reforms.
I scratch my head over it, Greg. I don't know. Going back to the budget and the state of Illinois' economy. In the days leading up to Governor Pritzker's State of the State and budget address, Moody's Analytics released an economic forecast for the state. On the positive side, Moody's said that Illinois did see some modest economic growth in 2024, but they gave a warning for 2025 and down the road. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and a lot of it is dealing with Illinois' sluggish economy. And compared to the national average and even to some of our neighboring states, Moody's doesn't hold back and says that while Chicago may be a good place to go work, it's expensive. It's expensive when it comes to taxation. It's expensive when it comes to labor. And those types of things aren't just Chicago-centric, but it matriculates all throughout the rest of the state as well. So overall costs are a driver for economic activity. And something else that Moody's highlighted leading up to that budget address was weak demographic trends and deep-rooted fiscal problems. Those are some of the terms coming straight out of the report. And some of those problems include mounting pension obligations, a shrinking tax base as the state continues to see an outflow of Illinois residents moving to other states. Those are some of the biggest hurdles that Moody's sees in the long-term outlook. And they say that the state's outlook is, quote, tarnished primarily by its past budget woes, weak population trends, and high tax burden relative to other states. Overall business costs are only slightly higher than in the U.S., but firms in Illinois tend to pay more in taxes, and labor is on the expensive side. This is obviously something that we've been watching. It seems to be report after report after report, puts Illinois in the bottom of states when it comes to economic output and activity and costs. We have the second highest property taxes. When you take all combined tax rates, we're among the highest. All of that feeding into the demographic trends that Moody says really are going to be problematic for the future. And even while there might be some economic activity that increases nationwide, Illinois historically has fallen behind. The state's unemployment rate averaged 5.3% in the fourth quarter of 2024. That's compared to the national average of 4.1%. So another example, during the Great Recession of 2007-2008, it took Illinois more than a decade to bounce back in economic returns from the Great Recession. Very similar when COVID hit. Illinois took longer than the rest of the country to get back to pre-COVID levels of employment. So what's behind all of this? Democrats, they tend to, want to make certain types of tax credits for industries they think are going to grow, like, battery manufacturers or data centers. But Republicans have said the tax rate across the board needs to be lowered so that even small businesses can survive and thrive. But as it is right now, you've got regulations and taxation that are a burden on businesses. And if a business doesn't want to invest in jobs or their facilities and grow in a state like Illinois, they're going to find those opportunities in other states, be it Missouri, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa. I mean, these are obviously some telltale signs that Moody's highlighting. Will legislators take this report from Moody's, which was an official Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability reports that they commissioned Moody's to make. So legislators have this information in front of them. Will they take it as a prescription of sorts to bring about some changes?
Greg, you referenced a couple minutes ago the out-migration. You and I talk about that. The Center Square writes about that frequently. I don't think it gets enough attention elsewhere across the state. Of course, Governor J.B. Pritzker denies that Illinois is suffering significant population losses, even though all the evidence is there to show that Illinois has. That's fewer taxpayers contributing to Governor Pritzker's record budgets year in, year out. That's fewer consumers going out to the grocery store, to the movie theater, restaurants, etc. That's fewer dollars for local businesses. That has to have an impact on the economy.
No question. And when you have a shrinking tax base, as Moody's highlights, while the budget continues to grow, you're going to have to find those funds somewhere. And in particular, last year, the governor had nearly $1 billion in a variety of different tax and fee increases. Now, the governor says no tax increases this time around, but how they're going to plug what was estimated to be a $3 billion budget deficit heading to the next fiscal year, I guess we're going to try to find some efficiencies as we see a slower than average rise in revenue. How all of this is going to come together by the end of the fiscal year and make for a balanced budget, we'll see. But obviously, the outmigration has been very large. We're anticipating this summer an annual update from the Internal Revenue Service that will show outmigration numbers from the state of Illinois. They look at how many tax receipts were in Illinois moving to other states in the previous year. And in just the most recent report we got from the IRS last summer, it was $10 billion of lost individual income moving from Illinois to other states.
Wow.
Will we see that type of number this year around? Not sure. But Dan, as you know, we had 10 years of population decline. This past 11th year, we did have a population increase. While there were around 60,000 or so Illinoisans who moved to other states, that was offset by the 140 or so thousand people who moved to Illinois from other countries. That's likely, and something that Moody's even highlights in their report, that's likely not going to continue, especially with the Trump administration tightening up the border. Now that Trump's in office and that border is being closed and immigration enforcement's happening and even deportation efforts are underway, it's likely that Illinois and other similar states that are Democrat-run are not going to see the inflow of international migration to their states as they saw under the Biden administration. So we'll be watching all of these numbers very closely.
Greg, we only have about a minute left. I want to transition to one more story. While Governor Pritzker was giving his State of the State and budget address, Chicago City Council was meeting, and they decided to table a request from Mayor Brandon Johnson to borrow $830 million to fill their budget hole. Just tell our listeners briefly about what's going on there.
Yeah, and this comes after they passed a $17+ billion budget for this calendar year, and that was followed up by a downgrade from a credit rating agency. So clearly, Chicago's finances are struggling, and this idea of trying to get a $800 million bond issuance, for those who don't understand bonds, just think of it as it's borrowing, right? The state is going to go out and sell bonds. They're going to get money for that, but they have to pay that back with interest. So that would have been an expensive endeavor. And Chicago aldermen seem to not want any part of it. And they went ahead and tabled that proposal. Will it come back? We'll be watching. But clearly that was something that Chicago aldermen were not willing to stomach at this time, especially following all of the other economic indicators that Chicago's grappling with.
All right. Greg, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of the stories we talked about and more at thecentersquare.com.